Welcome to this episode of the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma, and with me is Professor Pant from the Observer Research Foundation. This week, we have witnessed the first round of televised presidential debate in America, which, according to most international media reports, marked a new low in the history of presidential debates, with Biden and Trump clearly not impressing the voters or people world over. So we will look into that. But along with that, a very sensational revelation came out of America that President Donald Trump, despite his very obvious disdain for all the precautions against the spread of coronavirus, has tested positive for COVID-19. He and the First Lady, and this is when a person who was very active in his campaign and his program, Hope Flix, had tested positive, but he did not show any, or he did not take any kind of precaution even after that. And now the big question is, what or how will it really affect the American elections, the campaign, the presidential debate, the 2 rounds of presidential debate that are yet to take place? And along with that, we will look at India's India is moving forward in its effort to, to look east policy or neighbors first policy with its new round of talks, summit talks with Myanmar and Sri Lanka. So we will look at all of that. But first, let's look at America, Harsh, and the president testing COVID positive, the First Lady testing COVID positive. Let's understand how is it going to affect the American elections, which are very, very near. How will it affect the rallies? Because all the political rallies that Trump would have done would be on hold. Along with that, the 2 presidential debates, one on 15th and one on 22nd. What would be the future of that? The president is in quarantine till about the 15th of October.
This is quite extraordinary, Naghma, because it's a question of optics for Donald Trump, for the U.S. president, who has constantly underplayed the threat from COVID-19, and his policies on COVID-19. He wanted to not make it the central issue in these elections. He was trying very hard to keep that away outside the political discourse, and unfortunately for him, it has come back bang on at a time when most voters in the US would start looking at the campaign. Whatever we have been discussing over the last few months, no one really cares about US elections so far behind in the US. It's only in this month of October that voters actually start looking at the campaign, the voters, the debates. And I think to have this at this point in time is terrible optics for Donald Trump, because it puts that issue right at front and center of his campaign of US presidential elections, which he has been trying to avoid. He has, after all, been trying to make a case that, look, America is doing very well compared to other countries. America is recovering fast. We are back on the growth trajectory. In fact, he, in one of his pre-recorded speeches just before he was declared COVID positive, he was reported as saying that America is getting out of this problem. We are doing very well. So clearly there is a dissonance. There is going to be a dissonance in the minds of the voters as to what Mr. Trump is saying and what is actually happening on the ground with the US president and the First Lady herself coming into the grips of this terrible virus. So I think it's a question of optics, and how he plays that remains to be seen.
But Harsh, is this unprecedented? When something like this happens very close to the election in any other country too, then what happens? I mean, right now we all hope that President Trump recovers on time, but what happens, suppose during the presidential debate, who will be the, how will that go forward, or the elections? I mean, when you look at other nations or in America, there has been a history of such incidents.
Well, no, not really. I mean, again, this crisis is unique the world over. So I think we are all grappling with it across the world in our own ways.
But when England, and when Boris Johnson tested positive, then his secretary was in charge. So if Donald Trump,
no, I think that there is a clear line of succession in the US. I think that's not going to be a problem. The vice president can always take over. You have had situations where, during the time of Ronald Reagan, for example, or even time of George W. Bush, when they were undergoing medical treatments, the second in command took charge of the process, and that's the way law is. But I think technically you can have if you're looking at it very technically, Mr. Trump can come back to the campaign, and in fact 10 days of self-quarantine or isolation, or he's in hospital today, we are told, but 10 days of quarantine and recovery is deemed to be enough to bring the individual back to the normal life. So if he recovers like most would be hoping, then by October 15th, when there's a next presidential debate, he can participate in that. There is no problem. I think the question becomes, what if the situation becomes acute? What if his health crisis becomes acute? What if he's not able to come back into the election campaign? I think for him, there are two questions. One question is his own campaign, which, he likes personal contact. He likes personal rallies where he actually gets a lot of, energy from the crowd that often is there at his campaign. So if he's not doing that, then I'm sure he's missing out. He doesn't like virtual engagement. In the past also, we have seen Mr. Biden was doing more virtual engagements, whereas he was out there and about trying to make a case to the voters. So I think one issue is that he would be feeling the pinch in his election campaign. It's so close to the election date. It's 10-15 days off the campaign is a big deal as far as he's concerned, although he's saying that he'll be doing a lot of virtual rallies, etc. We'll see what happens over the next
Absolutely.
week.
Some reporters and analysts have also raised the question of American security, or is it a threat to American security? Because there is this point about Russian interference or Russia trying to meddle again through cyber attacks, especially in a situation like this. Some reporters and analysts have raised this question too. So is it a concern?
Yes, I think, whenever you have the top leadership in such a situation at a time when there is already, a transition is taking place, and this period from October to December is seen as a transition phase in American politics, when the government change, is on the verge of a change. You can have the same administration, but a very different contours of that administration emerge, even if the incumbent gets elected. And if there is a change of guard, then of course you are going to have a very different complexion of the government. So nothing much happens in terms of the decision making as such. And therefore, the government is at its weakest in some ways, because government's guard is lowered, and people are concentrating on domestic electoral issues. There is no one really in charge in that sense, because the president is out there campaigning. However, of course, you have a situation that the second in command, the vice president, is deemed to be in charge, and as you would have read, he was immediately tested and found to be negative. So that's good news. That in a sense, the decision making is in his hands. He can. Of course, make decisions, critical decisions. And of course, there is a long line of succession. You have the Speaker of the House. You have the senior most Republican in the House if something dramatic happens. But I think the issue here is also if, for example, Mr. Trump, gets really serious, and then what happens to the election calendar? I mean, many people have raised this issue of, can it be postponed? Can it be, can the date be changed? Can someone on the ballot be changed? I don't think that is as easy as perhaps it looks. You need congressional majorities in both houses, and that is not going to happen. So you're not going to see a change in the date because Mr. Trump is unwell. And I think that's where in some ways for American electoral calendar, the challenge lies. How do you make a case that how does Mr. Trump how does he make a case that he's fit enough, well enough, not only for the first 10 or 15 odd days, but also then to get back on the campaign trail, do the kind of campaigning that he does, and make a difference to the polls that are not in favor of, that are not in his favor at the moment. So I think we are looking at a relatively more turbulent phase in the last lap of these elections. And these elections have nothing but have been extraordinary in so many ways. So we continue to see developments every week.
Absolutely. Very extraordinary times and extraordinary elections this time. And it's a very critical time for America. And extraordinary in many ways, when I say that, look at also the presidential debate that took place, where Biden and Trump, in some newspapers and international media, we've all seen the reports, how it was criticized and probably called one of the worst presidential debates in history. of American politics, because the level and the standard of the debate was really very, very low, where the two candidates were actually seen as engaging in a spat. So I read somewhere that it was like a spat between two septuagenarians. Now, when you see that, and also to defend himself, how Trump starts naming countries, which was China, Russia, and now India also came in. So how do you analyze this? And how do you look at this debate? You've been watching all the debates, American presidential debates that have taken place.
Oh, I mean, this was quite bad by I think by all standards. And in fact, it was not a debate. It was it were two people, uh, you know, two gentlemen, old, white, male, reflecting a certain a certain sense of American democracy getting tired of itself. You get a sense that here is a democracy that is not being able, or a political class that is not being able to come to terms with the challenges that America faces today. And these two individuals, one can have, obviously one of them will win in November, but they do not reflect the kind of challenges, the kind of leadership that America needs at this particular point to actually, provide a sense of conviction, to provide a sense of confidence to a country that is actually facing a crisis of confidence. You have multiple fronts that have been opened up, and therefore it is no surprise that you would have, those who don't perhaps like America that much, or those countries that feel adversarial, like China and Russia, would be gloating that look at our leadership, look at we are decisive, we can make policies, we don't have to worry about, of course, it's an assumption that that they would make, that we don't have to worry about opposition of this kind. But I think somewhere down the line, American democracy will have to reinvent itself, because if this goes on, that you are not only losing the domestic confidence. I think if you saw some of the polls, domestic American polls, Americans were not very happy, or very disenchanted with this debate. And if you see the international polls, international perception of this, there is certainly, even America's closest allies would feel what is happening, what is going on. Why is it that a country that used to be the beacon of freedom, liberty, and everything good, and everything normatively that we subscribe to as the great ideas of global politics and global value chain, in that sense, what is happening to this democracy? So I think that in some ways, what we saw was not a debate. What we saw was not, in some ways, this ideational contest between two opposing camps. We saw very personalized animosity between two elderly gentlemen being reflected on the stage, and without any discussion of the policy priorities that the country, that America needs at this point. And that, I think, is extremely problematic of course, for Americans themselves, but it is also problematic for those who believe that America should lead in the world much more robustly, and those who believe that that America needs to be a much more important player in global politics. And I think that's the message. If that is the message that comes out from America, then I think that is very dispiriting for a lot of other stakeholders who have a stake in how America behaves in global politics.
So clearly very challenging times for the world politics, and people who hope, like you said, when America was looked upon as beacon of freedom and liberty and equality, but the kind of debate which was, as you clearly said and rightly said, that it was a spat on a personal level. And Biden also was very disappointing, whoever hoped that we would be probably better than Donald Trump. Now, if we move away from America and look at what India is doing, its neighbors, and India's neighbor first policy, then we've had very interesting developments where there was a bilateral summit between India and Sri Lanka. Prime Minister Modi and Rajapakse engaged virtually, and Prime Minister Modi has put out the priorities or the concerns of the Tamil people. The expectations were high, but do you think the fault lines were apparent, and at the core were the aspirations of the Tamil people? And it was a bilateral summit, but very clearly the third country, or the proverbial elephant in the room, China's presence could be felt in the subjects that were being discussed or the outcomes there, because China has again invested heavily in Sri Lanka too. So China's presence there has increased. How would you see this bilateral summit and the effort between the two countries to come closer? There have been cultural ties also have been discussed. The Buddhist circuit has also been discussed. All that is there.
Well, in some ways, this is a continuation of New Delhi trying to engage the Rajapakshas ever since, Gotabaya came to power last year, and now you have the massive victory under the leadership of Mahinda Rajapaksa. So you have the so-called Rajapaksa clan running Sri Lanka, and India, in the past, especially with Mahinda Rajapaksa, the history is not very good, because we have had in the past situations where Mahinda Rajapaksa in particular was seen as closer to the Chinese, and so there were some problems, there were misunderstandings when he was the president last time. Now, since then, much has changed, and I think what perhaps the entry of Gotabaya Rajapaksa has done is to give the relationship a bit more stability, because and I think the experience of the last 5 to 6 years, that China, yes, China has invested a lot, but with China comes a lot of burden. And the debt burden is going nowhere. You had to sign the Hambantota port on a lease of 99 years to the Chinese, despite Sri Lankans trying to get it out from the Chinese, and they did not succeed. So I think there is a realization within Sri Lanka that perhaps they need to disentangle themselves from the Chinese stranglehold. And at the same time, there is also this realization that certain red lines of India will have to be respected. So I think this engagement at the bilateral level, which interestingly is Mr. Rajapaksa's, Mahinda Rajapaksa's first bilateral engagement in the neighborhood since he became Prime Minister, shows that somewhere that recalibration is happening. Both India, both New Delhi and Colombo realize that they need to engage with each other, recognizing each other's priorities, and both cannot do away with each other, given our geographical proximity, given our cultural linkages, and given there is a larger challenge that China poses. There was a very interesting statement that came out from the, I think it was the National Security Advisor of Sri Lanka a few weeks back, wherein he said that, look, Sri Lanka will always have to follow an India first policy when it comes to security, because India is our closest neighbor, and we want to cultivate that relationship. So I think as far as the security strategic matters are concerned, we are moving into an area where there is a great degree of greater comfort than, say, in the last Rajapaksa regime. And perhaps that augurs well. We are now, I think, talking about a line of credit on the defense matters.
Yes.
And I think the idea there is that defense relationship with Sri Lanka had to be strengthened. We are looking at defense procurement, defense engagement with Sri Lanka, supplying weapons. We are also looking at training of military personnel. I think around 50% of seats would be reserved for Sri Lankan personnel in India and for military institutions. I think all that means that we are moving into a relationship where strategic matters, when it comes to strategic matters, India will have a priority, and India and Sri Lanka can work together to make a case to their respective constituencies, that they both are on the same page. Economics, trade, connectivity, of course, is a different matter, where India clearly does not have as deep pockets as Chinese have. But there also the recognition that in Sri Lanka that it needs to diversify, perhaps augurs well for India. So we will see how this engagement develops. But I think so far signs have been that the shadow of the last Mahinda Rajapaksa regime had been let go, and there is the two sides are now beginning to have a dialogue, which is much more substantive and which is much more explicit about the priorities of both sides.
So you see, I mean, there's an improvement clearly and positive signs coming out of the India-Sri Lanka relationship there. And when we look at Myanmar, India has also had a talk with Myanmar, and Myanmar is a very strong pillar, as a key pillar in India's neighborhood first policy. India is also providing debt relief to Myanmar, like in Colombo also had requested India to defer the debt payment. Here, India is providing debt relief to Myanmar. So how is our relationship with Myanmar looking, and how do you see this engagement with Sri Lanka and Myanmar in the larger perspective of the neighborhood first policy that India is following?
Myanmar, I think, is looking very well at the moment, because India has been very proactive in Myanmar, and in fact, Foreign Secretary Shringla is visiting Myanmar this week, next week, I think October 5th, in fact. where he's taking a very significant delegation to Myanmar, which includes the Chief of Army Staff. So in a sense, what we are looking at now when it comes to Myanmar is a whole of government approach to engaging Myanmar, where you have defense issues, where you have foreign policy, bilateral diplomatic issues, where you have economic issues, all coming together under one rubric. And at a time when Myanmar will be heading into elections, parliamentary elections next month. So clearly for us, it's very important that we are engaging all stakeholders there, not only those the civilians, Aung San Suu Kyi, her party, opposition, but also the military, which again remains a very, very important instrument of state in Myanmar. Even if Aung San Suu Kyi and her party gets elected in this month's elections, then they will be working in coordination with the military as they have done last time. So I think India's engagement there is important, and India's engagement, as you were asking, in terms of the larger regional context, is very important, because what India has done is to focus now on the East, focus now on Bay of Bengal, focus now, because Pakistan, of course, the engagement is not going anywhere. We are not seeing any movement, any improvement, and the Pakistan-China relationship is getting much more strengthened. So India's focus, as far as neighborhood is concerned, has been for some time now on the eastern frontier. And that means that Bay of Bengal, the BIMSTEC has to be strengthened. And what India has done by putting, strengthening or trying to make a case for BIMSTEC is to expand the remit of its immediate neighborhood. So initially, when you used to say neighborhood, it used to be the SAARC countries. Now, if SAARC is dead and BIMSTEC is on, then you have two countries which are part of Southeast Asia, Myanmar and Thailand, which are part of BIMSTEC. They are now seen as part of India's immediate neighborhood. So India is able to now have a seamless engagement with Southeast Asia. If you say Thailand and Myanmar are our immediate neighborhoods, then that means that India is part of Southeast Asia more organically. You don't have to say that we are part of South Asia, we need connectivity to Southeast Asia. We are connected to Southeast Asia because our historical, our cultural linkages with countries like Thailand and Myanmar give us a gateway into Southeast Asia. And of course, that's where the larger theater of the Indo-Pacific comes into operation. That's where China comes into being, China's presence, China's footprint. So in a sense, what we are trying to do, or at least what New Delhi seems to be trying to do for the last few years, is to revive that shift towards the Bay of Bengal, to make a case to countries on the eastern frontier that they matter, and that India is willing to engage with them at a much more substantive level. And the outreach towards Myanmar, therefore, allows India to make a case to Southeast Asian countries, to ASEAN, that India is an organic member of Southeast Asia, and therefore it doesn't have to be Southeast Asia and India. It has to be that India is part of larger Southeast Asian landscape, where India has equities, where India has interests, which are organic, which are sui generis.
Okay. So India's neighbors, as far as Myanmar and Sri Lanka, and when you look at this side, it's looking good. You're saying that there is optimism as far as our relationship with Sri Lanka is concerned, or our engagement in Southeast Asia. Well, it's a very, very critical time in the world with the American elections very close, and kind of crisis that we are looking at. So we'll be following this in our next episodes. But for today, we have this much time. Thank you very much for joining, and thank you, Harsh.
Thank you.